Welcome back to App Stories. Today's episode is brought to you by Concepts Collide and SourceGraph. I'm John Voorhees, and with me is Federico Fetici. Hey, Federico.
Hello, John. How are you?
Good. We are going to continue our discussion today about the system apps. We talked about a bunch of them last week, but boy, there's so many changes being made across the board between the iPhone, iPad, and Mac on all the various Apple system apps that they each deserve a fair shake at, being discussed and going through all the different feature changes. So we've got a handful more to cover today. I don't know, where do you want to start?
I want you to tell me everything about Home and what's different in Home, because I feel like you just rebuilt your setup, or you are in the process of rebuilding your setup. I am tearing down my existing setup as we speak, so my Home app is relatively empty at the moment. Essentially, like now that I had to remove all the lights and my speakers and the TV. Basically, everything that I have left now is one temperature sensor and the HomeKit cameras that we still have. And the one change that I wanted to mention right away that I really appreciate in Home is the new grid view for the cameras. That's obviously third-party apps like HomeCam have offered a grid view for years now, and it's good to see Apple finally catching up here and having a proper grid view that you see in the main screen. But obviously that's one feature. That is a major redesign of the Home app that's happening in iOS, iPadOS, and macOS Ventura. So where would you like to start, John?
Well, I guess I'll start with a tangent about tearing down a HomeKit setup, because it is not super simple, because it's easy enough to unplug all the things that you have, unscrew your light bulbs, take out the smart plugs, whatever you own. And when I move, though, setting that stuff back up is tedious, because most of it then has to be factory reset, even the light bulbs, because they remember the old network they were on. Now, you could set up your Wi-Fi network with the same name and password, and that would probably simplify it a little bit, but I didn't do that. I started fresh with a new Wi-Fi network, and I had to go through and look online and figure out how you do factory resets of things like light bulbs, which, some things have a button that you just kind of hold down and eventually it blinks, and you're basically back to square one, and you add it back using the add button in the Home app. But other things are not so obvious. Things like a light bulb, for instance, where I had some nano leaf light bulbs where you had to like turn the light on and off very rapidly, like 6 times. And once you did that, it was reset. I mean, it was definitely designed to be a procedure that no one would normally do, where you had to like turn the light on, turn the light off within like 3 seconds, 6 times in a row rapidly, and that reset it, something along those lines. Anyway, that process is a little more difficult than it needs to be. It is nice to hear that you're enjoying the grid view, because one thing I have not set up yet are cameras. Being in an apartment, I don't have as many places to put cameras as I used to when I had a house, and areas outside and stuff like that I could use that with. But I am going to test that out over the summer and get a better feel for what that grid view is like. I've always enjoyed that in HomeCam. The biggest thing, I guess, coming to Home this year is really more than anything else, it's a redesign. And it's really a welcome change, because I think this is something that I've had an issue with really since Home was released, is that those big chunky square tiles were just not a good fit for every kind of device that you had in your HomeKit setup. Because first of all, they were all kind of these white square tiles that had icons on them and a name, and they weren't very distinguishable one from the other. That has been, that UI has been tweaked over time, and it has gotten better. But this year, there's a real big change, which is you can have multiple sizes of tiles.
Yes.
And that's a really good change. And I think it's an interesting design choice from Apple's standpoint, because when you think about it, the old design with the big chunky tiles, it didn't work well on the iPhone at all. And it always has been clunky on the Apple Watch, especially too. But once you started getting up to a big iPad or to a Mac, the size of those square tiles didn't matter nearly as much because you just had more screen space to fit them on. And, this is one of those, I think, design issues that is tough for developers, Apple's developers and designers included, which is designing apps that can scale from the smallest screen up to the biggest screen. And size classes is a big part of that. But what we're seeing here is something a little different because these tiles can still be the big chunky squares, or they can be smaller rectangles. It's the user's choice. And what I like about that is that it allows you to cram a lot more on a screen on an iPhone, but you can go with the bigger ones if you want when you have more screen real estate. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure if that's what to conclude from that. Is that a failure of size classes? Should those tiles maybe automatically resize down to the smaller ones on the iPhone? Or is it better to put that in the hands of the user and let the user decide? It's an interesting design problem and issue. And I kind of do like, though, I do kind of like how it is in the hands of the user here, because I think, size it's not all about cramming as many things onto a screen as you possibly can. There may be a particular tile, like, say, unlocking your front door, that you, even on your iPhone, you want that to be a big tile because it's something you do all the time, and you're, fumbling with your groceries as you come in from the car and you want to easily unlock your house. That's a good reason to keep that as a big tile, even on a smaller screen.
Yeah, I think Apple is right here in terms of allowing users to customize their home experience. And, that's one of the aspects of customization is the size of the tiles, but also color and icons come into play here. And that's another thing that they're doing in iOS 16. But I think really the big change is the new unified home view.
Yes.
So Apple has reorganized navigation and how you can sort of have a unified view of everything all at once, or you can still navigate, room by room. But the way you do it is different. So you can still go into the standalone view for an individual room of your setup by using the overflow menu, the ellipsis menu in the top right corner of the Home tab. And this Home tab is a new unified view for all your accessories, your scenes, and your rooms. So the idea is that at the very top, if you have HomeKit cameras, you will see the grid view that I mentioned a few minutes ago, followed by your scenes, followed then by a list of your rooms. The idea is that everything is contained in the Home tab. And you can just scroll and you will see your accessories, and you can resize them, as John mentioned, and you can interact with them by tapping on them. And obviously you can tap on the thumbnails in the camera grid, and you can check out the live video feed as usual. At the top of the Home tab, there's a couple of things that I want to point out here. At the very top, there's a new design for the horizontally scrollable list of accessories and sort of information. Like, for example, if you have temperature and humidity sensors installed, you will get a climate button that tells you, hey, it's 30 degrees right now. But if you tap on that climate button, it sort of acts as an inline filter. So when you tap it, it gets selected. And the Home tab filters just the temperature-related accessories and data points. And same with lights. There's a lights button, and if you press it, the view gets filtered to show you just your scenes that involve lights, as well as just the lights grouped by room. And that's the first detail I want to point out. This new row at the very top of the Home tab that allows you to filter and preview accessories and data points. Additionally, rooms, you can drill down into them. From the Home tab, you will see that each room has the name of the room and an icon next to it. So if you tap it, you will be taken into a sub-page for that individual room. And the same design applies here. You will see for example, your climate information at the very top, followed by your scene, followed by accessories. And when you are inside a room view, accessories are grouped no longer by room, because you're already viewing a room, but accessories are grouped by type. So you will see your lights into a group and your speakers and TV into another group and so forth. Finally, the home view can be customized, like you can reorder the sections of the home view. So if you want to get your scenes at the very top and say your cameras at the very end, you can do that. You can reorder all the sections that you will find in the home view. And in a way, this is kind of reminiscent of what we've seen in apps like Marvis or Soar for Apple Music. The idea is that you have this home page, and by default, you're given these sections in a specific order. But if you want to, you can first customize the size of the items contained within those sections. But second, you can even reorder those sections.
Yeah, I really like it. And it's an interesting new focus on categories of HomeKit accessories, which, if you're on the iPad or the Mac, in the sidebar, there is an entire categories section right there where you can go to things like lights or locks or climate control and that sort of thing. And it allows, especially when that it's organized that way by room, it accounts for people who have much larger collections of these accessories, because there are, HomeKit's been around for quite a long time now, and some people with larger homes have a lot of lights and a lot of smart plugs and things like that. And that was always a real pain point, I think, when you were trying to use the Home app with a big collection of these devices. This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Concepts. Infinite flexible sketching. Sketch, explore, and share endless ideas with Concepts Infinite Canvas for iPad. Designed for creators of all types, the app is ideal for visual thinking, note-taking, drawing, and professional design. Concepts lets you interact with and edit your sketches, helping you to think and draw smarter. As everything you draw in the app is a vector, you can move, edit, and organize your sketches after you draw them using natural gestures. Sketch freely with liquid pens, markers, and brushes in designer Copic colors. Create mood boards with images, PDFs, and objects, then draw right on top of them. Design with tools like grids, snap, and real-world measurements to create professional projects. Connect your devices to any display for instant whiteboarding with the app's built-in presentation mode. Concepts is used by designers and illustrators at Apple, Disney, PlayStation, Unity, and other companies globally to sketch, design, and communicate visually. Concepts comes free as a basic sketching tool and has the ability to unlock features via subscription or a one-time purchase. Plus, listeners of this show can enjoy a special 3-month extended free trial when they sign up for an annual subscription by visiting concepts.app/MacStories. Again, that URL for this very special offer is concepts.app/MacStories. Our thanks to Concepts for their support of the show. All right, Federico, let's talk about Notes, because Notes is very interesting in that last year it got tagging, just like Reminders. But Reminders got a lot more than just tagging. And things that were a little surprising that weren't in Notes, because if there's smart folders in Notes where you could last year create a smart folder based on a tag, but in Reminders you could make those smart lists based on all sorts of metadata, and it was disappointing that wasn't in Notes. But this year we've got that in Notes. We've got lots and lots of metadata.
Except the ability to actually filter by Notes content. That is a surprising omission from the list of metadata that you can filter for in Notes. Because, you can filter by dates, by shared status, by whether someone mentions you in a note. And the next one is interesting. You can filter by whether a note has checklists or not. And this is interesting because you can put together these smart folders where yes, you're filtering your notes, but you're also kind of filtering to-dos within your notes. This is not too dissimilar from what people are doing in apps like Craft and Obsidian, and especially
I was going to say that, yeah.
Where you can put together these filters that show you, yes, notes, but actually those notes contain tasks. And I mean, Apple doesn't call them tasks, they call them checklists, but the idea is kind of similar.
Yeah, it is because, especially the trend in things like Craft and Obsidian of people using daily notes. And a lot of times people who use daily notes use those with checklists and tasks. And both of those apps have ways to consolidate those items, those checklists for things, for instance, maybe there's a task you didn't complete yesterday and now you've got a new note and you want to move that task over to today's note. That kind of thing has been possible in Craft and Obsidian. And now you can do something similar with notes. If you were using that as kind of a daily notes system, you could bring together using that filter all of your notes that have checklists in them and then do what you want with them, whether you just use them from that particular view or maybe you're like cutting and pasting them out of one note and into another.
Yeah. And I was looking into this a while back, and I actually filed some feedback because, as we'll mention in a few minutes, one of the notes-related additions to iOS and iPadOS 16 is support for rich text in the shortcuts actions. So now in shortcuts, and we'll talk about this in a bit, but in shortcuts you can now create notes or append content to an existing note using rich text. So finally, you can pass formatted text or attachments. So a while back, I had this idea. So bear with me.
Because it's kind of wild. Is going.
I thought, wouldn't it be neat if I built an automation to replicate the idea of a daily note, right? In Notes. And this is easy enough. Like every day at midnight, run a personal automation that creates a note in the Notes app, and the title is the current day. But what if I also created an automation that kind of moved or copied or mirrored, call it whatever you want, my reminders for the current day as a checklist in the daily note in Notes, right? And then I could use a smart folder to filter those checklists. Well, the problem is, and I went down the rabbit hole for this, and I actually even asked one of our winners for Automation April to help me look into this. I believe I asked Chad, who participated and won one of the categories of Automation April. The problem is that Apple is using this custom flavor of HTML to render those checklists in Notes.
Oh, interesting.
So we actually looked in the syntax that Apple is using under the hood to render that HTML as checklists, and it's basically impossible to pass from shortcuts valid HTML that will render as a checklist in Notes. And I realized how specific this is, but given that now Shortcuts is so integrated with Notes in terms of passing rich text, and rich text, I mean, it's basically just HTML converted to a different format. I hoped that was possible, but it's not, and so I filed some feedback.
Well, it's a very narrow use case. On the other hand, there are apps like Obsidian and Craft use the notation, that the kind of the markdown version of checklists with the dash and the square brackets.
That's exactly what I asked.
Exactly. And you would think that would be something that they could add, where that was just an extension of how this stuff gets rendered, whether it's either plain, that's the plain text version, then you've got the HTML version. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Interesting.
Anyway, we should also mention that new in iOS 16 is support for creating quick notes on your iPhone. Obviously, you cannot swipe from the bottom right or left corner on your iPhone to invoke the quick note panel, because that gesture is reserved to multitasking on the iPhone, but there's a new control center toggle. Now, the difference here is that when you use quick note on the iPhone, it's not a floating window, unfortunately. It's a full screen sort of pop-up that lets you create a quick note or capture a deep link. And that would be fine. Like I can live with the full screen version of quick note for iPhone. I mean, Apple should really do floating windows on the iPhone too, but that's okay. My main problem, though, is that quick note on the iPhone does not let you navigate between your quick notes. every time you tap the toggle, it creates a new one. You cannot open and modify an existing quick note from the control center
no
toggle.
append or prepend, I guess, then. That's
No.
too bad. I mean, it's obviously a very share sheet-oriented implementation of this, which, as you said, would be fine, but the inability to kind of... Because I'm thinking, well, all right, maybe all I've got is my phone, and I'm doing some research, and I'm collecting some quotes and things from articles that I want to use later, right? But now I've got 20 notes instead of one with a bunch of things in it.
That's not so efficient. That's also another feedback that I filed, because that's okay if you want to keep it full screen. I understand, but at the very least, put a page indicator at the bottom of the, above the keyboard or something, and let me swipe through my existing quick notes, just like I can on the iPad. So
even a toggle for like a pen to last note would be nice.
Yes.
Because there are apps that do that kind of thing. I mean, there are a lot of note-taking apps to draw inspiration from here. I've look at drafts and a bunch of other things. Yeah. Interesting. Well, notes are being grouped now too, which is similar to the way Reminders is doing that, which we'll talk about in a little bit, where you get this these headers for a large group of notes that say today, yesterday, and maybe July, and then on back through the calendar, as a way to kind of break up these long lists of notes. I kind of like it. I mean, it gives you a good sense for, all right, well, yeah, I'm really just looking for the things that I've been working on in the recent past, and here's where that ends, because here's what I've been working on today and yesterday, and then here are the things this month, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I like that grouping. I think they're making the right call there. And overall, there's still a few things that I think, I was kind of hoping to see Apple addressing notes this year. And I do feel like they are falling behind, because we're going to wait another year, right, until iOS 17. Mm-hmm. And I think they're kind of falling behind this new generation of note-taking apps, and especially Craft and Obsidian. I continue to believe that Craft is the sort of experience that Apple should be looking for in terms of appealing to both novice users as well as power users. But two things in particular. I'm very surprised that you still cannot create internal references to other notes in your library. So internal links or wiki links, call them whatever you want to call them, but that's the idea. And I still think that navigation inside notes itself is so slow. And, we've seen in this new generation of apps like Craft and Obsidian, and, on the desktop, there's apps like Superhuman for email, there's Cron for the calendar, there's Agenda has this same feature. The ability to just press a keyboard shortcut and have this Spotlight-like launcher that lets you navigate sections of the app or find data in the app. Think how easy it is in Craft, for example, to just press Command F and navigate to a section of a note or find a note, right? This universal search box that lets you easily create content or find and navigate to your content. Instead, in Notes, you gotta go to the search box and search from there. And there's, depending on the view you're on, there's no keyboard shortcut to do that right away. It's really inefficient. And I really hope that this kind of UI is in the future of Apple's own apps, because I can imagine that if Apple does it, this keyboard-driven sort of command palette, it would work so well as a system-provided element in Mail, in Reminders, in Notes. I really think Apple should look into this.
I even have their marketing slogan for them. They can call it Spotlight Everywhere. Right? Or Spotlight Anywhere. It's no, you're right. And it's I think about it in terms of things like extensions on the various platforms, in that one of the themes that we've seen a lot of in the last 5+ years is the atomic parts of apps being spread out into widgets and into the share sheet and into shortcuts and into Siri and all different parts of the system, so that an app is a lot more than actually just the app itself. It's sprinkled throughout the system. Why shouldn't the same be true for Spotlight as well?
Yeah.
All right, Federico, what else do we have on notes? Do we have anything else going on? I guess we do have the any and all conditions when creating smart folders now, which is something we'll talk about with reminders too. But any and all are ways to set up your conditions for the smart folder, so you can specify that any of the conditions are true, or all of the conditions have to be true for it to be in that smart folder. And that alone is a very powerful addition, because it makes it just creates a lot more possibilities for what can be designed from a smart folder standpoint.
Yeah.
This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Collide. Collide is an endpoint security solution that uses the most powerful, untapped resource in IT: end users. Old school device management tools like MDMs force disruptive agents onto employees' devices that slow performance and treat privacy as an afterthought. Collide does things differently. Instead of forcing changes on users, Collide notifies your team via Slack when devices are insecure and gives them step-by-step instructions on how to solve the problem. By reaching out to employees via friendly Slack messages and educating them about company policies, Collide can help you foster a culture in which everyone contributes to security, because everyone understands how and why to do it. For IT admins, Collide provides a single dashboard that lets you monitor the security of your entire fleet, whether they're running on Mac, Windows, or Linux. That visibility makes it easy to prove compliance to your auditors, customers, and leadership. You can meet your compliance goals by putting users first. Visit collide.com/appstories to find out how. If you follow that link, they'll hook you up with a goodie bag, including a t-shirt, just for activating a free trial. That's KOLIDE.com/appstories. Our thanks to Collide for their support of the show. Okay, Federico, I want to hear from you about reminders, because I've been toying around with reminders a little bit and thinking about whether it could be my day-to-day task manager. And I still don't feel like it's flexible enough for what I want to create in terms of certain lists that I want to have. But I want to hear about what your experience has been like so far, because I know that you've been using it. You were using it as your primary task manager before the betas even came out, weren't you?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I was. And I'm really glad I made the switch several months ago, because the features that Reminders is getting in iOS 16 are really, really fantastic. And it makes me happy to see that Apple is continuing to tweak Reminders in the summer by adding new toggles and adding new options for the smart lists. So obviously, there are big changes for the power user side of the Reminders user base. Specifically, there are major changes coming to smart lists. We talked about this months ago on App Stories, and it's almost like Apple listened to our wish lists episode. Because one of the big changes in iOS 16, and this obviously is true on other platforms as well, is the inclusion of all these new filters for creating smart lists and combining multiple filters. As you mentioned in the notes segment of the show, you can now also filter by any or all conditions in Reminders as well. So it's no longer the case that you're forced to filter by all conditions being true. You can now put together smart lists where maybe there's a tag or maybe there's a date. Like, you can have this any type of filter that is really convenient and really opens the door for a lot more flexible and customizable smart lists. And plus, there are many, many more filters than before when you are creating a smart list. Like, for example, you can include or exclude specific lists. And this is actually something that I filed feedback on, because I would like to have the ability to include multiple or exclude multiple lists from a smart list. You can filter by priority, by flag, by location. There's new options for date, and you can mix and match, obviously, all this with the any and all conditions, and it's really lovely because you can now have a lot more freedom when it comes to putting together these filters for reminders. Once you do that, your smart lists can now be pinned to the very top of the Reminders sidebar. So those 4 buttons that you get at the very top used to be unchangeable by users. they were reserved to Apple's own default sections. Now all those are fully customizable. So you can remove, for example, the Today view if you don't want to see it. And you can pin one of your smart lists in there. So that's really nice.
What happens if you remove one of the standard built-in Apple ones? Can you put it back?
Now let's see. What if I hide Today? Where does it go? I have no. Why did you make me do this, John?
I didn't make you do anything. I asked you what happens. And once you started doing it,
Okay. So you click the ellipsis button, and there's a new button that's called Edit Lists.
Oh, okay.
And if you tap that, you can bring it back.
Oh, okay, so that's good. So it's not gone forever. I got it.
They're not gone forever. You can bring it back
because they're not editable. Those are not editable, right? You can just unpin them, but you can't edit them.
You can hide them. The button is called Hide.
Right.
So later you can bring it back. Also for power users, and this is on the iPad side of things, Reminders is one of the apps in iPadOS 16, I believe, joining Mail and Notes to support the new customizable toolbars in iPadOS 16. So you can customize the toolbar in Reminders for iPad. Say, for example, you don't want to use the tag button or you don't want to use the date button. Well, you can remove or reorganize and reorder those buttons, which I did. So that's really nice. So that's for smart lists. So you can have more filters, more conditions, you can pin them, and there's a new completed smart list that basically shows you all your completed reminders. And I believe that's sort of the gist of what's happening in the smart field department. There's a few other things that I would like to mention, if you will allow me, John. The first one is there's a new sort of Things by Culture Code, the task manager, sort of view in the Today section. Now, the Today section of the Reminders app, by default, will group your tasks by morning, afternoon, and tonight. You can disable this. This option is called Group by Time, and it's available in the contextual menu for the Today section. But basically, this grouping automatically splits your tasks based on 3 different times of day. Those are not customizable, unfortunately. So there's really no way for me to say that the morning should last until 1 p.m., for example, because of my somewhat original schedule in life. But that's not customizable right now, but still does a decent job. And the other thing I want to mention is you can have reusable templates in Reminders now. The idea being that any list that you put together in Reminders can be saved and shared and reinstalled at a later point in Reminders as a checklist, whether it was made by you in the past or made by somebody else. But say you have a packing checklist that you want to use every time you leave for a trip, but otherwise when you're done with the trip, you don't want to see it anymore in Reminders, you can save that as a link, and when you need it, you can just bring it back. Or you can install checklists made by other people, right? So you can imagine how this opens the door for Reminders being used as, I don't know, a media recommendations app or an app to share restaurant recommendations with people, right? Because of the rich links and the sort of the rich notes that are also supported now in iOS 16, these reusable templates, I'm sure, will come in handy for a lot of people.
Right. Yeah, I guess they've added more notifications when there are shared lists too,
yes.
Both when things are completed and when they're assigned, which I think you and I used that for a little while and basically decided it wasn't for us. But I do think that that's a good thing. You know, I think if you're going to have shared tasks, you really do need to know when someone else is making changes, and it's going to be a lot better now in terms of knowing when those changes are made, either on the adding them side of things or completing them, which is good. I think for me, the thing that with Reminders that has kept me away, I like what has been done a lot, and I think it's going to be perfect for a lot of people. I think for me, a lot of what I like about Good Task, which I'm still using right now, is the ability to do things like Kanban boards by day. You know, basically filtering and sorting and grouping things by date and project more than anything else, so that I can kind of look at my day and see, here are the club things I'm doing, here are the Mac Stories things I'm doing, here are the admin things I'm doing, and have those all broken down. And then even within those groupings, having them sorted in different ways, whether it's by priority or time or how long they've been on my list, different things like that, which allow me to slice and dice that information in different ways. But I do feel like I have to give reminders a little more time, because I haven't spent enough time fiddling around with its new groupings and smart lists that and I think there's a lot that can be done there, and maybe I can get most of the way there. I don't know.
Yeah, something that you mentioned the Kanban boards. So, that's one of the things you can do in Good Task. But one of the other things that are new in iOS and iPadOS 16 that I want to mention is there's a new view for when, and this is a relatively lesser known feature of reminders, but you can group multiple lists in reminders. It's like having a folder that contains multiple lists. Now, in iOS 16, there's a new view for the root level of that group. So let's say that you have a group called Work that contains your Mac Stories and Club Mac Stories lists. These are individual reminders lists that if you want, you can open individually. But you also created a work group. Now in 16, if you tap on the work item on the group or folder in the sidebar, you will see all the reminders for those lists contained within the group at the same time. So you can see two lists at the same time inside at once in a group. And I'm kind of wondering, you can sort of put together, and I believe this is an idea that somebody shared in our Discord server a few weeks ago. If you think about it, you can sort of fake your way into a Kanban setup like this, because if you create a group called Work, and if you create 3 lists called, I don't know, Next Up, In Progress, and Done, and you can see these 3 groups all at once, and you can drag and drop reminders between them. And that's sort of like having a board. Obviously, the only downside is that the board is not horizontal, it's vertical inside the group.
Right.
But yeah, you can see multiple lists at the same time if you use groups in iOS and iPadOS 16.
Yeah, that's a really interesting idea. And I think probably the thing that's causing the most friction for me right now is that reminders is very much organized by list as opposed to by day. And the way I tend to view my tasks is first by date and then by list, so that and that's it's possible to create some smart lists that approximate some of that stuff, but yeah, I think I rarely actually go to any of my particular lists, like a Mac Stories list or a club list. I almost never do that. I always start in the today view, and sometimes I look at my tomorrow view, or I'll have a next 7 days view that's like a Kanban board, and that I can drag things back and forth between the days. It's very much more of a time-based system than it is a list-based system. But anyway, it is a lot of nice changes coming.
Yeah. In theory, what you could do is you could create a smart list that is today. You can then create another smart list that uses the relative range filter. And so you can do relative range in the next day. And then you can do another relative range in the next 3 days.
Right.
So you can put together this, and then you can combine them in a group. And that's like having, because that should work, because then you will have a group that has your tasks grouped by day, even though they belong to different lists.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. I think I'll have to check that out. That's a great idea, Federico.
That should work. Like off the top of my head, but that should work.
All right, I'll check it out today. This episode of App Stories is brought to you by SourceGraph. So you've hired a brilliant developer. That's awesome, but you've also got to get them onboarded. If your company is growing, onboarding is a common occurrence that takes a lot of time and effort. One of the biggest challenges for new hires is getting up to speed on the projects that their teams are working on. This can be tricky if code bases are large. Thankfully, SourceGraph is there to make it easy to move fast, even in those large code bases. Developers know that knowledge is most usable when it's findable. Centralization helps, but most companies store information in multiple locations. So how do you know that knowledge is accessible to those who need it? As a code intelligence platform, SourceGraph gives developers what they need to drive their own learning over time and in different situations. Teams without SourceGraph need to rely on asking colleagues questions and reviewing out-of-date documentation, which is cumbersome and time-consuming. But with SourceGraph, every developer can search through millions of repositories and find specific code, saving themselves and everyone else a whole lot of time. So that when questions do come up, you know it's the important stuff that's worthy of everyone's time. SourceGraph was created to make developers' lives easier. And today, they work with leading companies across every industry, including 3 of the top 5 tech companies, plus PayPal, Uber, Plaid, GE, Reddit, and Atlassian. Visit about.sourcegraph.com today to learn more. That's about.sourcegraph.com to find out why some of the biggest tech companies in the world use SourceGraph and to see how it can help yours. Or just click on the link in the show notes to let them know that you heard about them from us. Our thanks to SourceGraph for their support of the show. All right, Federico, let's close out this episode today talking about one of our favorite all-time topics, which is, of course, shortcuts. And there are, there aren't what I would call structural UI things changing with shortcuts this year, which is good because we got a lot of that last year, and it's still been settling down. I mean, there's been a lot of progress made since the last versions of OSs came out, tightening things down and making things work even better than before. But this year we're getting a lot of actions, and one of the ones that I think a lot of people will be excited about that we've been hoping for a very long time is what we've already mentioned, which is rich text support.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yes, that's exactly what we mentioned a few minutes ago. You can now create or append rich text and attachments to your notes. But what you just said, I think, is an interesting point, and I kind of want to know what you think about this. There really isn't a big feature in shortcuts this year, right?
No,
there's
isn't.
no like the automations or a new design for this, or even a category of actions that brand new additions for UI stuff. There isn't a single major change to shortcuts. Arguably for developers, the big change is what's it called? The app shortcuts. Basically, the idea that apps can come with bundled shortcuts that people can use right away without donating them to Siri beforehand. Right. That really that's not a major change in terms of what shortcuts can do. It's a change in terms of how discoverable shortcuts can be. But in terms of what you can actually do with shortcuts so far in the beta cycle, kind of similar to last year.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think that is okay in large measure, although, I mean, I feel as though I'd like to have seen some more shortcuts tied to the new features that we've been talking about in these other system apps, and even with the OSs, things like Stage Manager. Right? I mean, that I think is more problematic in my mind than the fact that there are really just new actions. There are a lot of new actions. They're sprinkled throughout shortcuts. They do bring a lot of existing wishes that we've had for a lot of years true with adding things and catching up some of these apps. But at the same time, they're catching up from things that had maybe been neglected for a few years. They're also kind of still falling behind because I'd really like to start seeing day and date shortcut actions coming to system apps so that when we talk about some of these new things in reminders and notes and home and everything, that there are shortcut actions right alongside those features that allow you to implement them. Because I'd love to be able to explain to people, here are all the new things that you can do in reminders, and here's how you implement each one of them in shortcuts. But we can't do that right now.
Yeah, and I think for me it's especially disappointing that we didn't get, at least so far in the beta cycle, we didn't get any integration with Stage Manager, nor did we get support for running shortcuts system-wide on iPad with the keyboard shortcut, just like you can on macOS. And we got quick actions in the Files app, which are basically the same quick actions we've seen in Finder on macOS before. However, those quick actions do not include your shortcuts. So that's like you kind of do one step forward, two steps behind, kind of like why? Like we have this inconsistency now. And also we didn't get new actions for Apple Music, for example, which is another thing that I was really hoping to see this year, or new actions for Photos. We did get new actions, as you mentioned, and I want to go through them quickly, but even those new actions, they're not, as you'll see, they're not really a big deal. There's new actions for voice memos. So now you can create voice memos and you can search your voice memos, which is fine, but I don't think voice memos was exactly screaming for a shortcuts integration before.
Right.
You have actions for books. So now you can open a book, open a specific collection, or change the theme that you're using in the Books app, or resize text. Like, okay, like it's fine to see that integration, but I feel like there were other integrations that needed to happen before, books and voice memos. There's some new actions for mail. So you can search your mail or open a mailbox. And when I say search your mail, it's not like you can search your email from shortcuts. You will be taken into the Mail app, but you can start a search from shortcuts, I guess. The most important change, as we mentioned, is in Notes. There's a ton of new Notes actions, from deleting and pinning notes to changing settings of a notes, opening a specific view in Notes, so there's like tag management for adding tag to a note, creating, deleting tags, removing tags. You can manage folders. You can now manage folders in Notes from shortcuts. So all those Notes actions are I think it's a great change, and I'm glad to see Apple doing this. And there are some new Safari actions in terms of tab groups and Safari views. As we mentioned on App Stories before, you can now open the bookmarks and history and reading list views of Safari with a shortcut. And you can open a tab group or create a tab group. You cannot retrieve the tabs contained in a tab group yet, which is an odd omission, also something that I filed feedback for. And then there's like the standalone action enhancements or new actions. Things like, for example, you can now remove the background from an image. This is a new system feature in iOS 16 that is used, like this technology is being used throughout the system. It's kind of the same technology that powers the new lock screen in terms of isolating the subject from a photo. You see that on the lock screen in one way, but you also see it in Photos, where in Photos you can tap and hold on a subject of a photo and you can drag out the subject and you end up with a transparent PNG. And in Shortcuts, you have the action equivalent of this system, which is take a photo, remove the background, just give me the subject with a PNG with alpha transparency, which is fine. You can optimize the file size of a PDF, right? So if you now pass a PDF to Shortcuts, Shortcuts will basically remove the images contained in the PDF and optimize, basically shrink the document to give you a smaller version of the document that doesn't have images inside of it. And then there's like dozens of tweaks that, there's like, I saw there's a personal hotspot action. There's an action to configure focus filters. There's an action to, for example, the open URL action now supports FaceTime links. The Shazam action you can now run from Siri. There's a new send email action that's the action was already in there before, but before it was limited to plain text. Now it supports rich text. Like there's a ton of like these smaller additions that are good to see, but don't really make for a major upgrade. The one thing I want to mention is that Shortcuts is much faster to use than before. Shortcuts is a lot faster to run. Shortcuts that used to take multiple seconds now run instantly. Apple really did a great job in cutting the delay that was often present when activating a shortcut, say from the home screen, from the widget, and just that, waiting for that split second for a list to come up on screen, now it comes up immediately. And those shortcuts no longer block the underlying UI. So for example, if you are on the lock screen, on the home screen, and you run a shortcut, but that shortcut needs to do something for 20 seconds. It used to be that if you got tired of waiting before and you tapped an icon, say, you know what, I don't want to wait, let me just open Safari or Twitter again, the shortcut would stop running in the background. Now it doesn't anymore. So even if the shortcut is doing something, if you interact with the UI, if you open Safari, if you open another app, the shortcut will continue running. So the non-modal status of shortcuts in 16 is a fantastic change. But yeah, as I mentioned, I would have liked to see more system level changes, right?
Yeah.
So integration with the keyboard, integration with files, integration with Stage Manager. I'm afraid that it's probably too late now to get those features, which means we'll have to wait until next year, most likely.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. It is kind of a big deal that those shortcuts are running in the background, because that has always been kind of the standard in iOS, where you tap away from some sort of modal and it's essentially a cancel action more than anything else. And so that's a very different change in that way. It's funny when you're talking about the images and the ability to drag out a subject and create a transparent PNG, it occurred to me that one of the longest running things that bothers me about photos is almost related to this and is still there. I don't know if you remember this, Federico. I'm sure you do. But if you take an image, say it's a transparent PNG, and you use Photos and you use the Photos extensions for an app like, say, a Notable, where you want to put an arrow on something or call it out. If you use that within Photos, it converts it automatically to a JPEG and gives you a background, a white background to your image. Whereas if you do it directly from the Notable app to begin with, it retains the background, the transparent background, as a PNG. It's like one of those things that Apple has never fixed that drives me a little bananas, because it automatically converts PNGs to JPEGs and gets rid of that transparency, which when you're doing things like the framed iPhone screenshots and things that we do for a lot of our stories, it's a real problem. I've trained myself never to use those photo extensions as a result, because they change my file format. All right, Federico, I think that's a pretty good discussion for today. We're done with the system apps. Congratulations to us, I guess. We've made our way through the entire system apps, and we'll have to talk about something else next week. We'll have to think about a good topic for next week. But I want to thank our 3 sponsors for this episode. That's Concepts, Collide, and SourceGraph. You can also subscribe to App Stories Plus. This is our extended version of App Stories. In the pre-show today, Federico and I talked a little bit more about Stage Manager and the experience I've had on the Mac moving back and forth between Ventura and Monterey. Those episodes come out a day early on Sundays instead of Monday morning, and they're ad-free as well, and in high bitrate audio, which is something not a lot of shows do, but we do, because we want to give you the very best possible version that you can get of App Stories. So just go over to appstories.plus to find out all the details there and subscribe. And you can find me and Federico over at macstories.net. Federico's on Twitter and Instagram, where he's at Viticci. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees. JOHNVOORHEES. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.